For a moment, I genuinely thought the email had been sent to me by mistake. I opened the attachment because payroll reconciliation was part of my Tuesday routine, and the numbers staring back at me made my whole body go still in a way I hadn't felt since my mother passed away 3 years earlier. The mug of flat white in my left hand started to shake, just slightly, and I had to set it down on the desk before I spilled it across the keyboard. I read the figures again, then a third time. The cursor blinked at me from cell H47, patient and indifferent, while my world quietly rearranged itself. My name is Tessa Whitcombe. I'm 31 years old, and I had spent the last 8 years of my life working as the senior operations analyst at Cowrie Ridge Logistics, a freight and supply chain company based in a converted warehouse in Penrose, Auckland. 8 years. I had started there at 23, fresh out of Massey with a commerce degree and the kind of earnest enthusiasm that older colleagues find either charming or pitiable, depending on their mood. I was the first one in most mornings, and often the last one out. I knew the import tariff schedules for 38 countries by heart. I knew which port officer in Tauranga preferred a phone call over an email, and which one needed both. I had built, almost entirely on my own, the internal tracking system the entire company now used to manage cross-border shipments. And according to the spreadsheet I had just opened by accident, I was being paid 43% less than 3 people who had been hired in the last 14 months. The HR director, a woman named Marlene, who had joined the company 2 years after me and somehow leapfrogged into a senior role through a combination of golf invitations and being the cousin of someone on the board, had clearly meant to send the file to the chief financial officer. Instead, she had typed my name into the recipient field because we both started with T and the email client autofilled. A small mercy, really, that incompetence had finally worked in my favor. I downloaded the file to my personal drive before she could recall it. I knew she would try to recall it within the hour, the way she always did when she made a mistake, and I wasn't going to let this one slip away. I closed the email, opened the spreadsheet for my saved copy, and read every line slowly, the way my father had taught me to read contracts when I was a teenager, helping him with the family orchard up in Karakari. Damon Pritchard, hired 11 months ago as a junior operations analyst with 3 years of experience, $92,000. Caitlin Rogue, hired 9 months ago as an operations analyst with 5 years of experience, $96,000. Hayden Mulvaney, hired 4 months ago with what his LinkedIn described as 2 years adjacent experience, $88,000. Me, senior operations analyst, 8 years at the company, the only person in the building who could explain why our system worked the way it did, $67,000. I sat there for what must have been 10 minutes before my chest started to feel hollow. Not angry yet. That came later. Just hollow, the way a paddock looks after the harvest is done and the rain hasn't started. I want to pause here and say something, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why didn't you ask sooner? Why didn't you negotiate every year, the way the books and the podcasts and the LinkedIn experts tell you to? And the honest answer is that I did. I asked in year 3 and was told to wait for the next budget cycle. I asked in year 5 and was given a 1.5% increase and a printed certificate that said outstanding contributor with my name slightly misspelled. I asked in year 7, and Marlene told me, with that particular smile she reserved for women she considered competition, that pay was based on market alignment and that mine was appropriate for the role. I had stopped asking after that, not because I had given up, but because my mother had just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and my father needed help managing her care, and I couldn't afford to lose the job while I was driving to the hospice every weekend. By the time she passed and I came back to work in proper form, asking for a raise felt like the kind of thing that could wait one more cycle, and then one more, and then one more. That's how it happens. Not because we're weak. Because life is happening at the same time as our careers, and most of us are just trying to keep the whole thing upright. So when I tell you I had been quiet for years, please understand that the silence wasn't laziness. It was survival. That night, I drove home to my flat in Mount Eden. I didn't put on music. I didn't call my sister Bree, even though we usually rang each other on Tuesdays. I made a cheese toastie, ate exactly half of it, and opened my laptop on the kitchen table. The clock on the wall said 7:42 p.m. I did not move from that chair until 4:11 inches the morning. I built a document. I called it, internally, What I Actually Do. It was 32 pages long by the time the sun started coming up over the Waitakere Ranges. I listed every system I had built, or significantly improved. The freight reconciliation tool that saved the company an estimated $400,000 a year. I had the figures because I'd been the one to calculate them for a board presentation Marlene had then delivered as her own. I listed the 17 client relationships I personally managed, including the 3 largest accounts that together represented 61% of our annual revenue. I named the contacts at each. I described the small, specific things only I knew about each one. The shipping coordinator at Fonterra, who needed a courtesy call 24 hours before any rate change. The procurement manager at Kathmandu, who only responded to emails sent before 8 a.m. The operations head at a frozen seafood exporter in Nelson, who would walk if anyone other than me handled their quarterly reviews, because I had spent a year learning the specifics of his cold chain requirements, and he didn't trust new people. I listed the people I had trained. All 4 of them, including, I realized with a quiet little laugh that wasn't really a laugh, Damon Pritchard, the man being paid $25,000 more than me. I had walked him through the tracking system personally over a 6-week period. I still had the training notes saved with timestamps. I listed the institutional knowledge that existed nowhere else. The reason we used a particular customs broker in Singapore that no one else in our industry used, and why switching would cost us roughly $150,000 in transition fees. The exact workaround for a software bug in our inventory system that the developer had never properly fixed, and that, if encountered cold, would freeze the entire shipment dashboard for 6 to 8 hours. The fact that our largest client's CFO had, in a moment of personal candor over coffee in 2022, told me that they only stayed with us because of the relationship they had with me, specifically, and that they were considering moving to a competitor. I listed all of it. I added screenshots. I added file references. I added dates. By sunrise, what I had was not a complaint. It was an inventory. A precise, dispassionate, devastating inventory of what would walk out the door the moment I did. I want to address something I saw in some comments people leave on stories like this, the ones who say it's selfish to hold knowledge that way, that I should have documented it for the company's sake. And they're right, in a way. I should have. But here's the thing nobody tells you when you're in your 20s and you're trying to be a good employee. When you write everything down, when you make yourself perfectly replaceable, you are training your employer to replace you. The system rewards the people who hold value, not the people who give it away. I learned that lesson the slow, expensive way. I am telling you now so you can learn it faster. I slept for 2 hours, showered, made coffee, put on the navy blazer I usually saved for client meetings, and drove to the office. Marlene was at her desk when I walked past her glass office. I saw her flinch when she looked up, so she had noticed the email then. She gave me the same tight smile she always gave me and went back to her screen. I kept walking. I went to my desk, opened my email, and sent a calendar invite to our managing director, a man named Jeffrey Halloran. The subject line said only, "Confidential discussion regarding compensation, parity, urgent." I scheduled it for 2 p.m. that same day. I marked it as high priority. Jeffrey accepted within 4 minutes. I spent the morning doing my actual job. I cleared 3 tickets. I approved a freight consolidation. I had a 15-minute call with the CFO of our second-largest client. I behaved exactly as I had behaved every Wednesday morning for 8 years because I wanted there to be no possible argument that my performance was the issue. At 1:55 p.m., I picked up my laptop, the printed copy of my document in a Navy folder, and walked to Jeffrey's office. He was already there, with Marlene seated to his left. This was not what I had asked for. I had asked for a confidential meeting. Marlene's presence was Jeffrey's way of telling me he had no intention of treating this as a real conversation. He thought I was about to make a complaint and that having HR present would let him close the matter inside 15 minutes. I sat down. I placed the Navy folder on his desk, but did not open it. I crossed my legs. I waited. Jeffrey did the speech I had heard older colleagues describe in the staff kitchen for years. He thanked me for my service. He said the company valued me. He said that pay was determined by a complex matrix of factors and that he hoped we could talk through whatever concerns I had so we could land in a good place. His phrasing was careful in the way that careful phrasing gets when it has been practiced on other people. I let him finish. Then I asked, very evenly, why 3 people with less experience and less responsibility were being paid between $21,000 and $29,000 more than me. Marlene cut in immediately. She said she could not discuss the compensation of other employees. She said she found it inappropriate that I had access to that information. She said that if there had been a data breach, it would need to be investigated. I looked at her for a long second. Then I said, "The data breach was your email to me yesterday afternoon. The one you tried to recall at 4:38 p.m. The one I had already saved." She went red around the throat first, then up to her cheeks. Jeffrey shifted in his chair. He tried a different angle. He said that the salaries of newer hires reflected current market conditions and that long-tenured staff had different compensation trajectories. He said that if I felt undervalued, there were processes for raising concerns through the annual review cycle. I said, "My last 3 reviews resulted in a combined increase of 3.8%. Inflation over the same period was 19.6. I have effectively had a pay cut every year I have worked here." Marlene jumped in again. She said that the company could not be held responsible for macroeconomic conditions. I said, "I'm not asking you to be responsible for inflation. I'm asking you to explain why a man I personally trained 11 months ago is paid $25,000 more than I am." Jeffrey said, very carefully, that he did not feel this conversation was being conducted in a productive spirit. I said, "Then let me make it productive. I am asking for a salary adjustment to $98,000, backdated to the start of this financial year. I am asking for a written commitment to a senior management review of my role and title within 6 months. And I am asking for a clear explanation, in writing, of the criteria that have led to my current position relative to my colleagues." Marlene laughed. It was a small, dry laugh, and she covered it with a cough afterwards, but I heard it. So did Jeffrey, who looked annoyed with her for the first time. He said, "Tessa, I appreciate you being direct, but the figures you're proposing aren't realistic. We can look at a 5% adjustment in the next cycle. Beyond that, I'm afraid the answer is going to have to be that this is the role and this is what the role pays. You can accept that, or you can consider whether the role is still the right fit for you." There it was. The accept or leave. Said gently, the way Jeffrey always said hard things, but said all the same. I picked up the Navy folder. I opened it. I slid the first page across his desk. It was the executive summary of my document. 1 page. Bullet points. Numbers. I said, "Before you finalize that position, I'd like you to read this. I'll come back at 4 p.m. I stood up and walked out before either of them could speak. I went back to my desk and sent the full 32-page document to Jeffrey's email address with the subject line, "Supporting documentation for our 2 p.m. discussion." Then I cleared my inbox, closed my laptop, and went for a walk along the domain. I sat on a bench near the duck pond and watched a kid feed crusts to a swan that was almost as tall as he was. I thought about my mother and what she would have said about all of this. She would have told me I had been too patient for too long. She had told me that, in fact, the year before she got sick. I hadn't listened then. I was listening now. At 4 p.m., I walked back into Jeffrey's office. Marlene was not there this time. Jeffrey looked older than he had 2 hours earlier, the way men suddenly look older when something has shifted in a room they thought they controlled. He had read the document. I could tell, because the printed copy was on his desk, with 3 colors of highlighter on it, and a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting beside it. He said, "Tessa, I had no idea about most of this." I said, "I know." He said, "I want to be honest with you. The numbers you're showing me about the freight reconciliation tool, about the client revenue concentration, about the cold chain workaround, these are not things I had visibility on." I said, "I know." He sat back. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He said, I need a few days to consider this properly. I'd like to come back to you on Monday with a formal response, I said. I appreciate that. I'd like to be clear about what I need by Monday. I need the salary adjustment. I need the written commitments. And I need an acknowledgement that the way my contribution has been valued does not reflect the contribution itself. If those three things are not in your response on Monday, I will be resigning that day and giving 4 weeks' notice. He nodded slowly. He said, I understand. I said, there's one more thing. I think it's important you know this is not a negotiating position. I am not bluffing. I have already had 2 conversations with people in the industry. I have options. I am giving you the chance to keep me, because, despite everything, I have liked working here. I have liked the people. I built things here that I am proud of. I would prefer to stay, but I will not stay on these terms. I left. I drove home. I did not cry. I had done my crying years earlier, in a hospice room, holding my mother's hand, and the part of me that used to cry about work had quietly closed its door at some point during that summer. What was left was something steadier, something that knew its own worth and was no longer prepared to discount it. Monday came. The email from Jeffrey arrived at 11:47 a.m. It offered a salary adjustment to $76,000, a review of my role within 12 months, and a paragraph of corporate language about how the company deeply valued my contribution and looked forward to continuing our partnership. 76,000. 12 months. Partnership. I read it twice. I closed the email. I opened a new document and typed my resignation letter. 3 paragraphs. Polite, clear, effective immediately, with 4 weeks' notice as required by my contract. I attached it to an email addressed to Jeffrey, copied to the board chair, and copied to my own personal email. I hit send at 12:14 p.m. Then I walked into Jeffrey's office, knocked once on the open door, and told him verbally that I had resigned. He stood up. He started to speak. I held up my hand gently and said, Jeffrey, you made your decision. I've made mine. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. I'll work my notice properly. I'll do a full handover, and then I'll go. He sat back down. He looked, for a moment, like a man who had just realized he had been playing a different game than the one he thought he was playing. The next 4 weeks were, in some ways, the most peaceful of my entire time at Kari Ridge. I came in on time. I left on time. I did my job. I wrote handover documents that were, deliberately, exactly as detailed as the company had ever asked for, and not one sentence more. I scheduled meetings with the 3 colleagues who would, in theory, be absorbing my work. I walked them through the basics. I answered their questions. I did not volunteer information they did not ask for, because I had finally learned that volunteered value is value forfeited. On my last day, the office held a small farewell in the kitchen. Sponge cake from the bakery on Great South Road. A card that everyone had signed. Marlene did not attend. Jeffrey gave a short speech that was kind in a vague, careful way. I thanked everyone. I shook hands. I drove home. I poured myself a glass of Pinot Gris, sat on my balcony, and watched the sky go pink over the city. 11 days later, the calls began. The first one came from Damon Pritchard. He rang at 10:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. He sounded exhausted. He said the freight system had crashed that morning, and they couldn't figure out how to reset the inventory dashboard. He said he was sorry to bother me. He asked, very politely, if I could just walk him through it. I told him, kindly, that I no longer worked at Kari Ridge and that any technical questions should be directed to the company's IT support. I wished him well. I hung up. The second call came from Caitlin Rogue 3 days later. The cold chain client in Nelson had escalated a complaint and was threatening to leave. Could I perhaps give her the contact's name and any background? I told her I was sorry, but I considered client information confidential to my former employer, and she should ask Marlene. She went quiet. We both knew Marlene would not have the information. The third call was from Jeffrey himself. He left a voicemail. He said the company was facing some transition challenges and that he would very much like to speak with me about a possible consulting arrangement. He named a daily rate that was, frankly, generous. I listened to the voicemail twice. I did not call him back. The fourth call, 2 weeks after that, was from the procurement manager at our largest client. I had been expecting it. He was a kind man named Alistair, in his late 50s, who I had worked with for 6 years. He told me, in a voice that was gentle but firm, that his company had decided to put their freight contract out to tender. He said, off the record, that this was largely because the standard of service had collapsed in the 4 weeks since I had left. He asked, also off the record, where I had landed. I had landed somewhere. By that point, I had taken 3 weeks to rest, then accepted a head of operations role at a competitor, a leaner, smarter company called Southern Cross Freightworks, headquartered in Parnell. They had offered me $112,000, a profit share, and a seat on the senior leadership team. The conversation in which they made the offer lasted 40 minutes. There had been no negotiations about my compensation trajectory. There had been no patronizing talk about market alignment. Just an acknowledgement, from a managing director who had done her homework, that I would bring real value, and that real value should be paid for. Alistair asked if his company could speak to my new employer about transferring their contract. I told him I could not solicit on behalf of my new employer for ethical reasons, but that he was, of course, free to approach any provider he wished. He laughed quietly and said he understood. 2 months later, his company signed a 3-year contract with Southern Cross. So did the cold chain client in Nelson. So did Kathmandu, in time. So did, eventually, 11 of the 17 relationships I had personally managed. Cowrie Ridge Logistics did not collapse, exactly. Companies rarely collapse cleanly. But by the end of that financial year, they had lost approximately 42% of their revenue. The board removed Jeffrey from the managing director role in March. Marlene was made redundant in June, in what the company described as a restructuring of corporate functions. Damon Pritchard, Caitlin Rogue, and Hayden Mulvaney all left within 9 months, 2 of them to companies I had recommended them to, because I am not a vindictive person, and they were not the architects of any of this. They were just the symptoms. I am 32 now. I have been at Southern Cross for 14 months. I am paid $124,000. I have shares in a business that is growing. My work is respected. When I have an idea in a meeting, the managing director writes it down in her notebook and acts on it the next day. I work fewer hours than I did at Cowrie Ridge and accomplish more. I take Friday afternoons off to drive up to my dad's place in Karakari and help him with the orchard, because life is finally a thing I have time to live. I want to leave you with a few things, because if you've made it this far in my story, you might be living in your own version of it right now. The first thing is this. Loyalty is not a virtue when it is one-sided. It is just unpaid labor with a friendlier name. A company that genuinely values you will pay you in line with your value, without you having to threaten to leave to make them notice. The second thing is this. Your knowledge is your leverage. Document what you do for yourself, not just for them. Keep a private file of what you have built, who you have managed, what you have saved them, what you have earned them. Update it every quarter. You are not being disloyal by knowing your own worth. You are being responsible. The third thing is this. The hardest moment is not the moment you leave. It is the years before, when you are still trying to convince yourself that things will get better if you just keep proving yourself. They will not. People who undervalue you will not start valuing you because you work harder. They will only value you more when they have to imagine doing the job without you. The fourth thing is this. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to leave a job that is hurting you, a relationship that is shrinking you, a town that no longer fits, a version of yourself you have outgrown. Leaving is not failure. Leaving is sometimes the most adult thing you will ever do. And the last thing, the thing I wish someone had told me at 23 when I walked into Cowrie Ridge for the first time with a fresh degree and a head full of hopes is this. Be loyal to your work, to your craft, to the people you love, but never be so loyal to a place that you forget you are the one who made it worth coming back to. If any of this resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Tell me, in the comments, about the moment you knew it was time to leave, or the moment you wish you had. We're all learning how to do this. We might as well learn together.